Hello and welcome. My name is Graham Cookson, OHE's Chief Executive, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, in which we will reflect on some of OHE's major research themes from 2023 and share our key insights. In a moment, I will kick us off by sharing our work on prevention. This will be followed by Grace presenting key learnings from our work on sustainability in the life sciences sector, before Chris discusses some important methodological and empirical advances in innovative outcome measures. We will then hand over to three colleagues, Matthias, Martina and Amanda, to talk us through three key policy reforms impacting our sector and how OHE's 2023 research reforms these debates. They will be looking at the EU pharma legislation, EU HTA regulations and the introduction of the Inflation Reduction Act in the USA. We've assembled a number of OHE's research leaders and subject matter experts for today's webinar. Martina Guerrao is a director and leads OHE projects expanding the evidence and shaping the debate around critical health policy issues, including value assessments of innovative health interventions, and is the team leader for our value and decision-making theme. Chris Schedule is also a director, and his interests centre on the use of health economics to maximise the societal value of scarce healthcare resources, including economic modelling of outcomes and value for money, and stated preference methods to elicit patient and public values. Chris is also our team leader for our measuring and valuing outcomes research theme. Amanda Cole is one of our associate directors with expertise in economic evaluation and reimbursement, particular interest in real-world evidence and analysis of critical health policy issues. She's the team leader for OHE's Economics of Innovation theme. Grace Hampson is an associate director and research theme leader for policy, organisation and incentives in health systems. She leads on a number of major policy research areas for OHE, including on prevention, sustainability and antimicrobial resistance. Matthias Hofer is a senior economist at OHE and a visiting researcher at the Centre for Health Economics and Policy Innovation at Imperial College Business School. His expertise and research interests include pharmaceutical regulatory science and policy and the economics of pharmaceutical markets and innovation. OHE is a charity and independent research organisation, and as such we focus our effort on the delivery of three charitable objects: promoting evidence-based healthcare policy by carrying out relevant research, promotion of the effective and efficient use of healthcare resources, and the facilitation of decision-making and awareness of healthcare policy issues by encouraging debate and dissemination of relevant research. We achieved these goals last year through many traditional channels, such as publishing our research in world-leading scientific journals and making our insights available through webinars such as this. But 2023 also saw a number of new initiatives for OHE, including launching two online global educational programs, one around the Inflation Reduction Act in the US and the other on the economics of vaccines in Africa. Both are freely available online and you can find out more at ohe.org. We also relaunched our educational offering through the OHE Academy and have launched our own graduate school. Another major milestone in 2023 was the introduction of the Change Initiative. Responding to the complex and multifaceted nature of health challenges, the Change Initiative is a vehicle through which stakeholders can collaborate, network, and focus OHE research on critical yet wicked problems. The Change Initiative officially launches this month, and the Global Challenge Research Fund our partners have created will focus OHE's research on two major global challenges: environmental sustainability and disease prevention. Sustainability in healthcare is crucial to ensure that healthcare systems can continue to provide effective and efficient services to individuals and communities without negatively impacting the environment or depleting resources. The promotion of sustainable healthcare policies and practices can help reduce waste, minimize pollution, and foster a healthier population. Yet how to do this practice is eluding us. Prevention and health system reform are critical components of achieving sustainable healthcare. A preventative approach can help reduce healthcare costs, improve patient outcomes, and decrease the burden on healthcare systems. Everybody agrees that prevention is a good thing, so why are we not doing enough of it? In today's webinar, we'll present our findings so far on these two important issues, but through the Change Initiative, we are committed to continuing our research in these areas in 2024 and beyond. Visit the OHE website for more information on the Change Initiative and how you can get involved. So this neatly brings us on to our first topic today, prevention. There has been a seismic shift in the burden of disease away from infectious diseases to non-communicable diseases, NCDs. The main four being cardiovascular diseases, cancer, chronic respiratory diseases and diabetes. And these are the leading cause of morbidity and mortality worldwide. Prevention is mentioned as a priority in so many organisations' annual reports, their strategies and their objectives. For example, see the NHS long-term plan, the NHSE England prevention programme and the major conditions strategy. And over the period 2011 to 2030, NCDs will cost the global economy more than $30 trillion, representing 48% of global GDP back in 2010. That is an enormous problem. NCDs lead to higher treatment costs. They impose direct economic burden on health systems, households and society as a whole. And they impose an indirect economic burden through significant productivity losses and via premature mortality, early labour force exits, absenteeism and working at lower capacity. There is perhaps no better current example of this than the state of the UK labour market. Over a third of the working age population, whether unemployed or unemployed or inactive, report a long-term health condition of some kind. NCDs are pernicious because they're easily preventable, but very often incurable. So why are we not doing more about it? You can see here in our navy box the remit of this report, where we're focusing on the Department of Health and Social Care's budget and the ring-fenced public health grant. This report is very much about England, but our future work with the Change Initiative will be broader and global. Prevention is a smart use of public funds. Is it cost effective? Yes. Investing in prevention can be 3 to 4 times more cost effective than treatment. Is it value for money? Yes. For the health and social care sector, primary prevention programs have been shown to offer returns to investment of more than 14 to 1. Are they effective? Yes. Are they good for individuals? Yes. Is it good for society? Yes. The cost of lost productivity in the UK economy due to preventable ill health has been estimated at nearly £70 billion a year. Is it good for business? Yes. A record 2.5 million people of the working age population are inactive in an increasingly tight labour market. Is it good for government? Well, yes. Reductions in preventable ill health can increase tax receipts, reduce welfare payments, and generate savings to the police and the criminal justice system. For example, a reduction by 10% in the obesity prevalence could reduce annual spending on unemployment benefits by £400 million each year. And is it good for the health system? Yes, of course. Unnecessary NHS spending associated with preventable conditions is estimated to be £2.5 billion each year. That's just for smoking related conditions. For obesity related conditions, the figure is £6 billion a year, and for alcohol, £3.5 billion a year. And with record backlogs, averting demand could further disrupt the functioning of the healthcare system is so crucial. And it's the same story around the world. This first piece of work that we published last year is focused on England, but as I said, the Change Initiative is going to take a broader look at the world. One of the things to remember, though, is we found several gaps in the current programs. So, for example, uptake of existing programs is suboptimal. So even where we have programs in place, they're not being used. So there are approximately 4 million people with hypertension who do not have a diagnosis. And those that are diagnosed, 30% are not managed optimally. There is no capacity to deliver the stated ambitions. For example, the NHS Diabetes Prevention Programme has been shown to reduce the chance of developing diabetes by 37% and is highly cost effective. Yet, it's only available for 200,000 people a year, when 13.6 million people are thought to be eligible. Given that approximately 10% of the annual NHS budget is spent on diabetes, and half of diabetes cases can be prevented or delayed with the right support, increasing uptake of that type of programme is going to be highly beneficial. Another gap is that investment is focused on short-term goals. Most primary prevention efforts pay off over the medium to long term. The UK is not alone here, but it suffers from chronic short-termism, which inhibits our ability to implement appropriate long-term plans. We need to focus on intermediate outcomes to help us demonstrate the success and value of prevention programs. And finally, prevention is underfunded. Of total NHS funding, only 5% was allocated to preventative care between 2013 and 2019. The public health grant as of 2023-24 financial year has been cut by more than a quarter in real terms since 2015-2016. Our report also looked at some potential solutions and strategies. So alignment of strategies and plans is really relevant to prevention. We need the development of clinically evidenced plans supported by politicians and clinical leaders to drive actions. We also need to think about issues around financing and contracting. As one of the big problems is funding. The changing need of prevention and the challenge of needing this investment upfront to generate future returns in quite a long-term plan is not exclusive to prevention, but it's very important. As such, there are various financial tools and contracting options available. For example, we came up with the idea of thinking about social impact bonds. These are financial instruments that allow outcomes-based payments, but also provide a mechanism for capital raising without requiring substantial additional government investing by leveraging the expectation of those future benefits. Payment by results is another type of outcomes-based payment which allows healthcare payers to be reimbursed should the expected outcome not be achieved. A version of this would tie reimbursement to healthcare providers not based on their activity, but on maintaining improvement population health. We could also try and smooth payments and pay over time, so outcomes-based payments can be combined with amortization, which is a mechanism for paying a large upfront cost by making smaller payments over a period of time, rather like a mortgage. Another option would be a central ring-fence prevention fund, so to take it away from competition with healthcare expenditure day to day. These type of ring-fence funds are used to dedicate resources to areas of very high importance. An example would be the Cancer Drugs Fund or the Innovative Medicines Fund. Another important aspect of the solution needs to be adjusting that balance of financial responsibility, because avoiding preventable ill health benefits all. It benefits the individual, it benefits government, it benefits society. And framing it purely as a health problem is limiting because we're focused on the health budget. And we need to think about how we measure outcomes, moving away from monitoring outcomes in the short term to looking at the long term and ensuring that incentives are aligned. So we ask, what is the way forward? And the first thing to know is that it's going to take a concerted effort from all stakeholders. Politicians should work to raise the salience of prevention amongst their peers, in particular, wider visibility and understanding of the substantial benefits of prevention for society. And the requirement for a systemic shift towards prevention is needed to elevate prevention above short-term political cycles. Government, including government departments like the Department of Health and Social Care, arm's length agencies and partner organisations should work to develop a strategy, including allocating the required funding. They need to go hand in hand. They're going to have to get creative. Non-health government departments and agencies must also be given some accountability for prevention. ICSs should work towards local solutions, prioritising prevention in support of healthy local communities and economies and fit-for-purpose local healthcare ecosystems. Successful prevention policies and interventions should be reported and shared with other ICSs so they can learn. And clinicians and other healthcare professionals should champion prevention in practice, but not just in theory. This involves identifying ways to promote prevention of ill health within areas of their influence and looking for opportunities to demonstrate clinical leadership in prevention. Buy-in from this stakeholder group will be key to driving system change. Critical messages around the benefits of prevention on health system capacity, health benefits for patients, and protecting the NHS may be key arguments for provoking action amongst this group. And industry should continue to innovate in the prevention space, concentrating on interventions that offer good value for money. Economists and other researchers like ourselves should take all opportunities to further the evidence base. And finally, members of the public should be empowered to take ownership of their own health and to have a social responsibility to do so to protect the NHS. Health should be understood as an investment, with understanding that the healthcare system is not there to fix all health problems, and nor is it able to. So in conclusion, we need a new deal for prevention. We must appropriately fund the transition to a wellness-focused health system and adapt to the changing economy and ecosystem this requires. We need to spend more, yes, but we also need to spend differently. And I will now pass over to my colleague Grace Hampson to discuss OHE's recent research on environmental sustainability in the life sciences sector.
Okay, so thanks, Graham. So now we're going to move on to spend a few minutes talking about sustainability and what role environmental considerations have or should have within the pharmaceutical industry and within healthcare. So why is this important? Why do we even need to talk about sustainability in this context? Well, healthcare is a substantial contributor to the climate crisis. It's estimated to be responsible for 4 to 5% of global greenhouse gas emissions, which is really substantial. And this figure is from the report shown on the left and shows the contribution of healthcare to national greenhouse gases across a variety of countries, from below sort of 2.5% to more than 10%. And within this, evidence from the UK suggests that the manufacture, supply and use of pharmaceuticals represents around a quarter of the UK NHS's total carbon footprint. So healthcare has a really substantial environmental impact internationally. And if health systems are to reach net zero, reductions in emissions from the pharmaceutical industry are going to be vital to enable this. So moving on. So this slide shows us the diagram of the supply chain, and understanding where in the supply chain most emissions are generated is important to target interventions to have the biggest impact on emissions. So the figure illustrates the main steps in the life cycle of a pharmaceutical product, from R&D, from research and development at the beginning to the end of a product's life. And the figure includes estimates of the contributions of each set of stages to the medicine's total carbon footprint. And you can see that emissions for pharmaceuticals are often concentrated during the early stages of the supply chain, during the raw material extraction and the manufacture of the APIs, which is the active pharmaceutical ingredient, although obviously the exact percentages are going to vary between products. So that's the supply chain, but the supply chain is only really part of the story. So the impact that a product has is also going to have an impact on the health system when it's used. So, for example, if a product reduces ongoing pharmacological treatment or face-to-face appointments, or reduces the need for further monitoring or other procedures, then that's going to have an impact as well. So only looking at the supply chain only tells us part of the story, and we need to look at the impact within the health system as well. We really do need to understand both of these types of impact and need to find ways of thinking about how to balance these different types of impacts. So thinking a bit more about pharmaceutical industry, well, what is particularly challenging here? Why is it so difficult to achieve green pharmaceuticals? Well, there are various challenges. So pharmaceutical products are highly refined and safety is prioritised by all stakeholders, rightly so. But this limits the ability of manufacturers to change processes to increase sustainability, or at least to change them quickly. And so that limits the pace of change. Pharmaceuticals are also supplied through really complex global supply chains involving a large number of stakeholders. So change requires a high degree of collaboration and coordination. Pharmaceutical manufacturing is also very resource intensive and has, R&D, research and development, has low success rates. So there's a high waste to product ratio on the supply side. And that's then compounded by waste on the demand side that we see through overprescribing and low adherence. So there's a really high waste to product ratio. And finally, a really key one is that health systems do not reward sustainability. So the financial incentive for manufacturers and the pharmaceutical industry to make these complicated and coordinated investments that would be required to meet net zero, those financial incentives are missing. So what can we do about that? Well, there are various policy tools that can be used to encourage decarbonisation. So how can we go about this? How can we incentivise this desired action? So we've included various different examples on this slide. So, for example, financial incentives, which can include things like tax credits, subsidies, carbon pricing mechanisms. We can use regulatory incentives, for example, emissions reduction targets, environmental standards, certification, that sort of thing, although they can be challenging to implement and enforce. There's reputational incentives, ESG, CSR, these types of things can impact investor behaviour and stakeholder behaviour. There's collaborative incentives that involving industry partnerships and knowledge sharing. And then finally, there's pricing and reimbursement or procurement incentives, which is where health technology assessment, or HTA, may play a role, which has been the subject of quite a lot of discussion. So if you're interested in hearing a little bit more about those types of incentives, if you're interested in any examples, then do take a look at this recent blog, which is a roundup of 2 panel sessions from ISPOR Europe, which was a conference towards the end of 2023. These panels both talked about sustainability and healthcare decision making, with a specific reference to health technology assessment. And the blog also includes data on payer expectations on the likelihood of sustainability playing a role in pricing and reimbursement. It has examples of industry action and suggestions for how HTA organisations may take account of environmental sustainability in their assessments going forwards. So specifically, NICE and ZIN contribute detail of what they're doing in this space. So that's a really helpful piece, which can be found on our website. So if you're interested, I encourage you to take a look at that. And then finally, looking ahead. So there's lots and lots of thinking and dialogue in this space. There's the key questions centre around what is the appropriate package of incentives in this area? Does that include HTA, that health technology assessment? And if so, what will HTA look like? How will environmental impact be incorporated into HTA? Within that, what data would be needed? How would that be collected? All of this requires further study. Research is ongoing, and within that, multidisciplinary and multi-stakeholder dialogue is going to be really key. 2024 is likely to be a big year. There's lots of discussion in this space, lots of ongoing research. We have various projects underway at OHE, and Graham's already mentioned the Change Initiative, for which sustainability is one of 2 key areas of focus for 2024. So lots going on. It's going to be a really interesting year. So with that, I'll hand over to Chris, who's going to talk to you about innovative outcome measures.
Thank you, Grace. My name is Dr. Chris Scudgel. I'm a director at the Office of Health Economics. I'm going to be talking about novel endpoints and non-randomized evidence in health technology assessment and the work that OHE has been doing around this topic. Scientific breakthroughs are challenging conventional trial design and clinical endpoints. We see gene therapies being developed that have lifetime treatment effects. We see more treatments for rare and small patient populations, breakthroughs in unmet needs that have no standard of care, and continued development in areas where there is a high efficacy standard of care. Each of these factors make it quite challenging to run a conventional clinical trial. Lifetime treatment effects, for example, mean unfeasibly long trials to confirm lifetime treatment effects. Rare diseases, it's difficult to recruit enough patients to achieve sufficient statistical power in some trials. Breakthroughs in areas with unmet need, it may be unethical to randomize patients to a control arm or a standard of care in cases where a breakthrough is potentially life-saving. So this is particularly the case in life-threatening conditions. And finally, as treatments get better and better, it becomes harder and harder to show small gains with one treatment relative to another relatively high efficacy treatment. It may seem that these small gains are relatively unimportant, but particularly in diseases where disability accumulates over a lifetime, even a small difference in the rate of progression of a disease can have a meaningful impact by the time we start looking further and further into a patient's lifetime. So for all of these breakthroughs are leading to challenges in designing efficient and timely clinical trials that let these breakthroughs get to the patients that need them. Alongside this, payers are increasingly concerned with paying for value and not paying for more value than a health technology delivers. Resources are stretched and payers are reluctant to make substantial investments, often in innovative treatments that have perhaps a one-time treatment. We can imagine gene therapies have a very high upfront cost and in theory a lifetime treatment benefit, but payers are reluctant to make that upfront investment without having a strong and confident understanding that it is indeed a lifetime treatment effect that they're paying for. In other words, the consequences of a payer making the wrong decision are increasingly great, and therefore payers are perhaps increasingly risk averse when they look at the evidence around these treatments. So we see a tension. We see a tension between innovators who want to run efficient trials based on novel endpoints or non-randomized evidence. At the same time, payers and value assessors are pulling in the other direction, saying they want to continue to see long-term randomized clinical trial evidence based on well-established, well-understood endpoints. And in particular, these well-established endpoints are important for understanding the relative value of a treatment compared to what's come before. If we switch the instrument that we use to measure value, it becomes difficult to maintain that continuity and make those comparisons. We see this tension playing out, for example, in biomarkers, where innovators are arguing for blood-based or even genetic biomarkers over survival as endpoints in clinical trials. We're also seeing increasingly louder calls for the use of non-randomized evidence and especially real-world evidence in regulatory and HTA decisions. The challenge facing both the innovators and the evaluators is how to reach a reasonable compromise between novel endpoints and established endpoints that have a long history and that are well understood. So we can, as I said, we can see this playing out around biomarkers. There's increasing interest in surrogate outcomes that are perhaps more efficient in terms of effectively predicting the final outcome that we're interested in a more timely and efficient way. Equally, composite outcomes. We are addressing more and more dimensions of a disease, and we want to understand how a new treatment affects all aspects or all dimensions of a patient's experience, perhaps not just that single survival outcome, for example, in a cancer trial. And then, like I say, interest in non-randomized and real-world evidence. This tension plays out over a number of questions. For example, do we want a surrogate to predict the established final outcome, or do we need to adopt an entirely alternative final outcome, final endpoint? If we do want a surrogate, what are the statistical criteria necessary to justify that surrogate? Equally, are there statistical properties of composite outcomes that we need to explore? And equally, does HTA need to reconsider its reluctance to accept composite outcomes? HTA and health economics traditionally have not been strong fans of composite outcomes. They often lump things together that have very different implications for cost and patient utility. But equally, they are important in running efficient trials where we want to capture different aspects of a patient's experience. As I mentioned a bit earlier, how do we ensure the comparability of new measures with the existing body of evidence? How do we make sure that when we say one treatment represents good value to the healthcare system, that is consistent with what we've said about the value of other similar treatments measured using different outcomes? Finally, can we lump all of this together in some respects by asking what's the role of innovative payment models in ensuring that payers are paying for value? So you can imagine here outcomes-based payments. If payers and assessors are nervous about the reliability of some of the evidence coming out of these clinical trials around value, is there a role for innovative payment models in solving some of that reluctance? I mentioned especially that beyond simply novel endpoints in clinical trials, the feasibility of conventional randomized clinical trials themselves is being challenged by some developments around urgent unmet needs, rare diseases, and potentially curative gene therapies. In areas of unmet need, there may not be a meaningful standard of care, and for life-threatening conditions, it may be unethical to randomize patients to supportive care. If we have a strong belief that something may save a patient's life, there are strong ethical questions about whether it's appropriate to randomize some of those patients to a standard of care that we know is not life-extending or disease-modifying. Equally, for ultra-rare conditions, it can be difficult to recruit enough patients to achieve statistical power or a representative sample of patients, especially within any one country, which regulators typically like to see, particularly HTA regulators like to know that the clinical evidence is reflective of the population in the country. Finally, as I mentioned earlier, RCTs are unfeasible for confirming potentially lifetime effects of curative intent therapies such as gene therapy. In light of these challenges, many people are suggesting that non-randomized evidence can complement RCT evidence in HTA. This can include single-arm trials with an external control arm. It can involve drawing on long-term disease registries to understand the natural history or the untreated experience of a disease. Or it can mean administrative data. So that's data collected as part of routine healthcare administration, not necessarily as part of a clinical trial, but information that can inform aspects such as healthcare utilization. It can inform hospitalization. It can even inform death. So there are a lot of things that could complement RCT evidence in situations where it may not be feasible. Finally, and perhaps going back to touching on what Grace was speaking about earlier, we can imagine the green QALY as an innovative outcome measure. The NHS has committed to carbon net zero, but this is going to require some understanding of the trade-offs between health, cost, and emissions. In particular, this means health economics is going to need new tools to understand society's willingness to pay for a green QALY compared to NICE's current 20,000 to 30,000 pounds per conventional QALY threshold. We need to understand, in order to produce a greener NHS and a greener QALY, are people willing to pay a bit more for that QALY, or are they willing to forego some of the health that they could have achieved in order to shift the existing budget towards greener, more sustainable initiatives? I think this is going to be a very interesting area in the very near future. So in summary and in looking ahead, the growing complexity of assessing innovative treatments will continue to challenge conventional clinical endpoints and trial designs. Novel endpoints and trial designs can facilitate timely assessment of efficacy and value while also addressing ethical challenges. Finally, efforts to promote environmental sustainability within healthcare systems will require some understanding of society's willingness to pay for a green QALY. Thank you, and over to you, Matthias.
Thank you very much, Chris. My name is Matthias Hofer. I'm a senior economist at OHE, and today I want to provide you with an overview of the main proposals for regulatory reforms in the European Union. These proposals have been put forward by the European Commission in April 2023, and they're currently under debate by the European Parliament and Council, with an expected vote in Parliament in April 2024. The following objectives have been laid out by the Commission. The proposal is to create a single market for medicines, ensuring that all patients across the EU have timely and equitable access to medicines. To continue to offer an attractive and innovation-friendly framework for research and development. To reduce the administrative burden. To enhance availability and ensure medicines can be supplied to patients regardless of where they live. And to address antimicrobial resistance, or AMR. The first main change concerns the protection and incentivization of innovation through the means of regulatory data or market protection. The EU proposals would move away from a one-size-fits-all incentive system. In contrast, it would provide a lower base level protection, but offer a variety of targeted add-ons that reward novelty, unmet needs, comparative studies, or access. For new medicines, the baseline regulatory data protection would be reduced by 2 years to a total of 6 years. For orphan medicines, the baseline market protection is reduced by 1 year or even 5 years in the case of an application without novel clinical development. The Commission, however, created a new type of data protection, which is dedicated to the repurposing of medicines, which could receive for the first time a 4-year data protection. These proposals aim to create rewards, but also allow earlier generic entry. However, the proposals may be challenging to pharmaceutical industry, stifle innovation in the future, or lead to a less competitive pharmaceutical market. Finally, the new incentives are based on many new regulatory concepts and definitions that could be challenging to implement on a fair and regular basis, like, for example, high unmet need or exceptional therapeutic advancement. One very interesting new incentive concerns the launch of medicines in all EU member states. currently, and as you can see on the top graph here, there is considerable inequity in terms of access to medicines across the EU. In the proposal, innovators would be incentivized to launch their products in all 27 member states, and as a reward, they would receive additional 2 years of regulatory data protection or 1 year of orphan market protection. And of course, as you can imagine, it could be challenging to actually launch a medicine in 27 countries within a 2-year time frame. And there are potential barriers to access that are outside of the direct control of any industry partner. The next incentive concerns antimicrobial resistance, or AMR. There is a growing international concern regarding AMR and the lack of a pipeline for novel antimicrobials. The EU regulatory reform package proposes a so-called new pull incentive for the development and authorization of novel antimicrobials. Priority antimicrobials would receive a voucher for an additional 1 year of data protection, which can be sold and transferred to any other medicinal product. This incentive is designed to bring novel antimicrobials to the market and provide rewards to innovators that are delinked from any sales or launch activities. However, this is just a pilot and it only guarantees up to 10 vouchers in a 15-year period. The scheme has also been criticized by stakeholders because the rewards are received without ensuring access to the novel antimicrobial itself, and the benefits ultimately go to the company that buys the voucher. And at the moment, the costs to society are unclear because it will depend on the product that will be protected from generic competition. So finally, there are a few additional changes that concern faster regulatory approval, a regulatory sandbox that would allow for more innovative regulatory solutions, initiatives to combat drug shortages and strengthen the environmental risk assessment of medicines, and there is a proposal to enhance transparency and the public reporting of funds that were received by innovators to develop their medicines. These initiatives can lead to a faster and more agile regulatory system, but they also increase bureaucracy for innovators, and it may be challenging for the industry to accurately predict drug shortages or provide full transparency on their R&D processes. So how does OHE shape the debate on the EU regulatory reform? The OHE research portfolio includes AMR and all the incentives that could be created to foster the development of novel antimicrobials. They also concern drug shortages and regulatory policy. I've highlighted just a few relevant research outputs from our recent years, and we are planning further research to be published this year. So make sure that you follow us on our homepage and on our social media. I would like to thank you for your attention, and I hand over to my colleague Martina.
So hi everyone, my name is Martina Garau. So as part of the policy reform theme, I will focus on HTA and discuss to what extent the increasing international collaborations can address some of the pressing access challenges. So starting with the European HTA regulation, the reasons behind its creation are the fragmentation of the EU market, with many differences in terms of processes and evidence requirements across member states. And these and also other factors have led to large variations in access to new treatments. So for example, statistics from the weight indicators produced by FBR show that in the last 4 years, the access gap between the highest and the lowest countries is 83%. And it's 80% in terms of longer timelines. So in terms of key objectives, the regulations are therefore aiming to promote convergence, harmonize methods and process, pool resources to conduct assessment and make them more efficient, and also making the system more predictable in terms of procedures for the private sector. And so that should lead to a more equitable access across Europe, and more generally, better health for patients and European citizens. And so how is this going to be achieved? So the new key processes are the joint clinical assessment and the joint scientific consultation. They both will focus on clinical domains So on the assessment or relative effectiveness, while economic effects and other context-specific aspects will be part of national assessment and decision-making processes. And there will be a gradual implementation of these processes starting January next year for oncology medicines and ATMPs. So there will be challenges, particularly in the short term, when parties will adapt and adjust to the new processes. And I will only highlight some of the points showed in this slide. So for EU policymakers, they will have to finalize the implementation acts and all the guidelines that will be required to start the process, and all in 2024. From the perspective of patients, it will be important to ensure a meaningful involvement at all stages of the process. And from the perspective of HTA and payer organizations, a key challenge, but also an obligation, will be to integrate the JCA reports into national processes to inform decisions. And the key promise is to support smaller countries or those with limited resources for HTA, which are those that are facing the largest access challenges that I mentioned before. And finally, for developers, they will have to deal with multiple types of analysis and comparisons to submit as part of the joint assessment, and potentially with those requested by countries, individual countries at a later stage. But reflecting beyond the technical exercise of defining the type of analysis and comparisons, which remains a very important aspect of the regulation, it's also important to think about more in the longer term and how the regulation should evolve. And for example, it's important to ensure that the new process takes on board learnings of the existing assessment systems, and in particular, for example, of the challenges in evaluating orphan drugs, which will be part of the system in 4 years. So I'm now going to talk about another type of collaboration that has recently been established between HTA agencies operating in Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the UK, including NICE. And so why this type of collaboration is taking place? Mainly because HTA agencies are facing common challenges due to the evolving nature of health technologies, so it makes sense to come together. I mean, key activities that have been indicated are pooling resources together, and so with the possibility of developing an assessment pilot or scientific advice, but most importantly, methods development. And one good example is the evaluation framework for digital technologies. So in terms of the expected benefits, so one positive outcome could be for the agency to align on the approach on critical topics such as surrogate outcomes or real-world evidence in decision-making, but also to accelerate the implementation of novel methods, which can take a long time to become practice. And we've done some work demonstrating this that I'll mention later on. So there are many challenges, as one might expect. And for example, one is the one of involving stakeholders in an international context, the limited resources within agency for such an initiative when they're already under pressure to deliver a program nationally, and also how these activities can be reconciled with national health policy priorities. So with this, I wanted to quickly show some of the how the OIT is contributing to the debate with some research that we've done in 2023. And they include an insight blog series on HTA systems around the world, a systematic mapping of HTA methods reforms by a set of HTA agencies, and a report providing evidence that NICE guidance have an impact in jurisdictions outside the UK. So to conclude my presentation, and going back to the initial question of can HTA collaborations address access challenges, So the answer is yes, but they need to be well designed and resourced. And the European collaboration, which has resulted in a formal regulation, has the prospect of improving access and efficiency, but it presents challenges and it may have unintended consequences. On the other hand, other types of collaborations with no formal or binding guidelines, such as that created between NICE and other HTA agencies, can help finding solutions to common method changes, but most importantly, can speed up the application of novel methods. And this concludes my presentation, and I pass it to Amanda. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Amanda Cole, and I'm an Associate Director at OHE, and I'm going to be talking to you about a key pricing policy reform that was a big focus for us in 2023, called the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. So I head up our Economics of Innovation team at OHE, and policy reforms across the development lifecycle all impact incentives for innovation and the process of development. My colleague Matthias spoke to you about regulatory reform in the EU, and Martina talked you through some reforms in HTA coordination. I'll be focusing on reform to policy further down the line of a product's life cycle in pricing and reimbursement, and the big changes here across the pond in the US. So the Inflation Reduction Act was signed into law by President Biden in August 2022. It introduced significant measures across a range of topics, including clean energy, climate change, but most notably for us in the provisions it had to reduce federal spending on medicines. So this is the first time that the US government has had the authority to influence drug prices, which was previously prohibited by law. So it's a pretty big deal. But what's the background? So currently, the US is a highly profitable market for pharmaceutical companies. Pharmaceuticals have generally achieved pretty high prices compared with relatively more regulated markets. And as a result, the US generally enjoys broad and faster access to innovation than anywhere in the world. As you can see in these figures, the highest proportion of medicines launch in the US first, and there's generally a much shorter time to access. So the US market is often considered to be a real engine for innovation in the pharmaceutical space. And the big question is, will the Inflation Reduction Act change this? And an even bigger question, will it have an impact on the rest of the world? Is the size of the US market such that signals there, which alter incentives for innovation and research, have an impact globally beyond the US? So first of all, what are the changes? What is the Inflation Reduction Act? So there are a raft of measures, including price negotiation, rebates of increases in price above inflation, also redesign of Part D to alter some of the cost sharing and cost caps for patients in the US, as well as some insulin-specific policies which are designed to improve access. If you'd like to find out some more detail about the spectrum of policies in the law, we've curated some learning modules which are freely available on our website and which will take you through a lot more detail. So you're very welcome to find out more there. But what's really captured the most attention in the Inflation Reduction Act is the price setting provision, which I'll briefly describe here on this slide. So eligible for drug price negotiation program will be single source drugs and biologics with the highest Medicare Part B and Part D spending, which have been on the market for more than 7 years for drugs or more than 11 years for biologics. So the maximum fair price, which will be what comes out of this negotiation process, will be based on the net price of the therapeutic alternative to the drug under consideration, adjusted in consideration of several factors, and those factors are listed here on the right-hand side. And those include clinical benefits of the drug compared to that of the therapeutic alternative, as well as manufacturer-specific data. So the negotiation process takes around 2 years from selection up until the introduction of the new price. And beginning in 2026, 10 drugs will have undergone price negotiation, and that will gradually increase year on year until by 2029 and thereafter it will be 20 drugs every year that go through this process. It's important to note as well that there are very high penalties for non-compliance or for failure to accept the maximum fair price. So what might the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act be? For many people, any efforts to rein in spend on medicines in the US are welcome, particularly for drugs that have been on the market already for many years. Price reductions of these medicines, which are bound to spill over into markets beyond Medicare, will lead to lower industry revenues. But the key question is whether that will matter for patients. So what we've been investigating and finding in our research in this area over the last year is that efforts to address drug costs need to be balanced with the downstream impact on innovation. If manufacturers have less time to make a return on investment for certain types of medicines, the size and the direction of research and development efforts will change, which might disproportionately impact certain areas of innovation. That means that some technology types or some disease areas will be impacted more than others based on how the Inflation Reduction Act is designed and which drugs are eligible for negotiation. For example, biologics may be favoured over small molecules, given the longer lead-in time before price negotiation. Certain disease areas will be disproportionately impacted as well. And given the timing of negotiations, which will take effect at least 9 or 13 years after launch in the first indication, that means that post-launch research into new indications is less likely to be incentivized, particularly if an expected price cut is imminent. So that may harm disease areas for which follow-on indications are an important source of treatment advances. And that's particularly important in areas such as rare disease and also oncology drugs. So prices will go down, but by how much and using what methods and what criteria is still a key question that there's still a lot to learn about. So we've studied developments closely over the last year. We've attended and presented at conferences and heard from experts across the US and Europe and across the globe on the issues arising around the Inflation Reduction Act. We've shared our views on the announcement of the first 10 drugs up for price negotiation and discussed how we see real-world evidence playing a critical role in negotiations over the coming years. So what do we think is next? What's on our radar? So along with my colleagues, we've highlighted some key policy reforms that have been extremely influential over 2023 and whose implementation or impact will continue to evolve in 2024 and beyond. Some of those reforms concern incentives for innovation. So the EU regulatory reforms reduce the baseline protection for innovation, but that's offset in some areas by which are specifically targeted to increase incentives. And my colleague Matthias talked you through some of those in his presentation. The Inflation Reduction Act likewise reduces return on investment, but its timing and the selection criteria that are used mean that some disease areas will be impacted more than others. Other reforms like the EU HTA regulation mark a change in how we do things and raise implementation questions and uncertainty around the expectations of different stakeholders. All of these reforms have good intentions, but what's for sure is that the detail of implementation and the methods that are used will be absolutely critical in shaping their impact. And at OHE, we're determined to keep on monitoring and investigating those in 2024 so that our research can highlight the important issues and help shape that debate moving forwards. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Amanda. That was wonderful. And thank you, our audience, for joining us today. I hope you found this short burst of insight from a range of OHE's research programs valuable. All of our research is published on our website, and if you sign up to our OHE bulletin, which you can do so on our website, you'll be the first to know about our latest work. Please also visit our website to find out more about the Change Initiative and how you and your organisation can play a role in addressing sustainability and prevention. Please fill in the feedback form, which will appear immediately after the end of the webinar. So thank you and goodbye.